Hello, my name is Fazzone, and my partners are Veeral, Shah, Carlson, Yasmine, Rahmat, and Jimenez. We're going to discuss education in developing countries with you today.
I will be discussing an article by Legion Pan called The Impacts of Education Investment on Skilled, Unskilled, Wage Inequality, and Economic Development in Developing Countries. This paper goes over the situation where skilled and unskilled worker wage inequality has been growing in several developing countries. As a result, the paper looks into whether government investment into education will or will not reduce that inequality. First, the paper assumes perfect competition in the producer sector. In going into the theoretical argument and looking at the formulas behind this, it argues that increasing government investment in education will unambiguously reduce the skilled-unskilled wage inequality by decreasing the wage rate of skilled labor and increasing the wage rate of unskilled labor. Then the paper changes the assumption and assumes that the producer services sector is monopolistically competitive. In this argument, it's more ambiguous to the effect of the education capital investment. It concludes that the growth of the manufacturing sector is key in whether or not the education investment will lead to stimulating economic development. It also concludes that the development level of the manufacturing sector plays a crucial role in determining economic development and when the government specifically carries out this education policy. This article has several strengths. One of the key strengths is the simplification of the argument to show its powerful point. The author uses mathematical and economic theory to show the significant impact that an increase in government spending on education can have directly on the economic development of these developing countries. However, it also shows weaknesses. It is a theoretical argument that does not look at any observational data. As mentioned in class, the theoretical argument is a weakness because Pan does not look at other factors outside of education investment. This is similar to the study on Africa we looked at, where education investment led to no significant expansions due to the potential problems in the quality of the education there and the lack of technology there. Additionally, the author does not address the different levels of education that could be more or less powerful in affecting this economic development than other levels. In conclusion, the author directly states at the end of the paper that the paper is just a stepping stone for future discoveries in education and economic development.
So the article I chose to write about was called Public Spending on Higher Education in Developing Countries, Too Much or Too Little by Nancy Birdsall. I found it online. Basically, I was just searching for the most interesting article, and I found this article really interesting because it addresses the problems with the views that public education in developing countries should really be focused on primary level education. And instead, this article is going to argue that research at higher levels can be redirected towards, or funds at higher levels can be redirected towards research. And that's going to really increase social returns relative to the kinds of returns that we're seeing out as a primary education. So the social to private returns on lower education, even undergrad, is much lower than for the graduate level. And this is because the private returns at these levels are so high. So the country itself is really not seeing a lot of the benefit, and instead that benefit's going to the individuals. This means that overall these countries' lack of local capacity to research is leading to a lot of shortfallings in tech, as well as an intellectual dependency or a knowledge gap. And that's a very damning problem for them going forward, especially economically. And that's maybe why we're not seeing as much growth from investment in education as we would expect. So if you look at my first graph, you see the declining benefits of investing in primary and lower level education as investment in education increases, so diminishing returns there. And you also see that the social returns are much higher as you go higher in education levels. So obviously the highest one would be not secondary, not primary, but higher education. And then really, if you turn to the second figure, you can also see that the developing countries are, like Brazil, for example, are spending actually quite a bit on education, but they're spending almost none, so 0.1% of GNP on R&D. And so that's a big problem. That's explaining why they still have this intellectual gap or intellectual dependency, even though they're spending quite a bit on education relative to the US and UK. So some of the strengths of the articles, I thought this was a good way to see education starting to deliver gains to the economy. Second, I thought it's a direct effect of research leading to local improvements. The weaknesses, of course, is that it could could promote inequality in these places because the highly educated are getting more resources and the lower education are not. It relates to class because, Easterly spoke a lot about how we're not seeing these returns to education. And this article provides a way for us to finally see these returns materialize.
I will be discussing perceived returns to education and the demand for schooling by Robert Jensen. Jensen begins by discussing perceived returns to education in less developed countries. So typically, students make their schooling decisions on the basis of limited or imperfect information. In class, we discussed overestimated returns to education, but however, the decision to drop out is made at a much younger age in these less developed countries, and the only data may come from those around them, which are generally a poorer population. In addition, residential segregation by income could lead to underestimates of the returns to schooling. So using survey data for 8th grade boys in the Dominican Republic, the perceived returns to secondary school are extremely low despite high measured returns in the country. Jensen uses random control trials to select a subset of schools which were provided information on the returns estimated from earnings data. From the table shown, for the 4-year period over which students were followed, the treatment caused a statistically significant 0.2 increase in years of schooling on average. However, the impact on the likelihood of returning to school with the following year, although large, is only marginally statistically significant with a p-value of 0.08, and the impact on completing secondary school, although positive, is not statistically significant. One strength of Jensen's study is that it allows for inequality among the poor. Jensen divides the table results into 2 columns, which you can see as poor and least poor, and this allows for a more holistic analysis of the effects on the poor. For the poorest households, the effect of the treatment is extremely small and not statistically significant for all 3 measures of schooling. We saw an example of labor demand as a limiting factor in our class study on the relationship between wage levels and child labor. So when wages are too low, the opportunity cost of education for the poorest families is too high, and they'll forego education to send their children to work, even though this leads to a lower equilibrium. Therefore, a combination of costs, low family income, and credit constraints will limit the effectiveness of the intervention. One weakness of the study is that it focuses on boys, which could introduce a gender bias. So in class, we discussed how returns to education for girls is higher when women make more decisions in the household and make more decisions on who to send to school. Therefore, the perceived returns of the boys in the study could be lower than the perceived returns of girls if they were also interviewed and used in a study in the Dominican Republic. So in conclusion, the intervention that provided information on the measured returns increased both perceived returns and schooling, but the results suggest that demand is a very limiting factor in the school level in the Dominican Republic. This kind of intervention is a very cost-effective way to increase schooling and could be a really great model to follow in other less developed countries.
So I'm going to talk about conditional cash transfers and whether they have a lasting effect on education and employment rates. So conditional cash transfer programs aim to alleviate poverty by increasing human capital accumulation of children from poor families. A particular way these programs achieve this is by offering direct incentives for families to send their children to school by means of cash subsidies to the families of these children. The program provides cash payments to families that are conditional on children regularly attending schools and on family members visiting health clinics for checkups. So we evaluate 2 types of longer run impacts using both experimental and non-experimental methodologies. First, we have the longer run effects of short differential exposure as shown in quadrant B on the table. This shows experimental impacts based on an initial short 18-month differential in exposure using difference in difference estimates that allows us to assess whether the initial program impacts from short exposure differentials are robust or they fade over time. Secondly, we have the longer run effects of longer differential exposure as shown in quadrant C on the table. This shows difference in difference matching impacts that provide insight into longer run program impacts of longer differential exposure and into whether there are increasing or diminishing returns to the duration of program exposure. And referring to what we learned in class, it's useful to think of education as an investment. And as with any investment, you can compare its costs and benefits. The best way to compare it is by equating the marginal cost in terms of foregone earnings from work and foregone leisure to the marginal benefit of spending additional time in school, in particular, higher earnings as an adult. And so the biggest strength that I found in the article is that Berman, Parker, and Todd vary the exposure differential with the control group so that the long-term effects of the CCTs can be focused on without having to make broad assumptions based on short exposure. But the biggest weakness that I found is the limitation that most controlled experimental evaluations only last for a year or two because of concerns about the political feasibility or fairness of withholding treatment from controls for longer periods of time. Also, as previously mentioned by my colleagues, an increase in education doesn't always translate into an increase in GDP. We see that as they accumulate schooling, the children will receive higher wage offers. Assuming diminishing marginal returns to schooling, at some point the marginal benefit of schooling will no longer exceed the marginal cost. These considerations lead us to expect that the programs will decrease working over the short run, but over the long run, the program might increase working. And so, in summary, the findings suggest, firstly, that the initial differential exposure of 1.5 years appears to have an impact on schooling attainment that is robust with the passage of time. And secondly, that the program impacts on schooling attainment increase almost linearly with the duration of exposure to the program.
As my partners have explained, there are immense public and private benefits to effective education. As it becomes applicable to the educational systems of developing countries, the question of schooling becomes one of optimal practice. How can educational systems in developing countries be best controlled and run? This is the subject of school governance, teacher incentives, and pupil-teacher ratios, experimental evidence from Kenyan primary schools by Esther Duflo, Pascaline Dupas, and Michael Kremer. So rather than focusing solely on student-teacher ratios alone, this article argues that the basis of improvements in the educational systems of developing countries is that of teacher incentives and parental governance and monitoring of schooling systems, such that augmentations in school resources, let's say additional teachers to lower student-teacher ratios, are not misused or wasted. So in a randomized controlled trial in Western Kenya, first grade students were randomly assigned to a class either taught by a pre-existing civil service teacher or one taught by a contract teacher, an additional teacher, whose position was renewable after 1 year contingent upon his or her performance as evaluated by the student's parents. Parents were trained in order to properly evaluate teachers, and the results of the trial were that students assigned to the classes taught by contract teachers not only exhibited higher attendance rates than their counterparts in civil service teacher-led classes, but on average their performance on test scores were higher as well. This is perhaps attributable to the increased incentives that contract teachers had. As we discussed in class, one of the primary detriments to educational systems in developing countries is teacher absenteeism. But as this article cites, contract teachers were 12 percentage points more likely to be found in class teaching during unannounced spot checks than their civil service teachers in comparison schools, and 28 percentage points more likely to be present than civil service teachers in the schools they were assigned to. So this article really makes a sound argument for the empowerment of parents in the governance and monitoring of their children's schools in developing countries. The randomized controlled experiment provides an objective means to compare the two teaching contract type, civil service, and contingency bases. So while this successfully attests to the internal validity of the experiment, I do believe that there is maybe it is vulnerable to a lack of external validity, where in Kenyan schools, like these Western Kenyan primary schools, may be different from their counterparts elsewhere. So I'm not sure if this approach will necessarily work everywhere. Also, it assumes that contract teachers, if they transition into civil service positions, won't lose that extra exerted effort that is thought to be the cause of their students' superior performances.